Good morning, boys and girls. Time for chapter 13 in Snow Treasure. All right, where we left off last. If oh yes, okay. So they had been hiding all the gold underneath those snowmen, and then the last comment Peter made was if the snow holds. So we know that could be very important. Let's see if they get away with transporting this gold and if the Germans find out. Here we go. All that week and all the next, there was a steady stream of children and sleds down the mountains. And every sled carried gold, sometimes as much as would equal 20,000 American dollars. Each morning saw a band of children trudging through the woods to the cave where the gold had been hidden in a bare few days before the German invasion. By noon, the Norse children were well on their way to the Snake to bury their loads beneath the snow. Always the same thing happened. Partway down the mountain came the stop for lunch. From pockets came the flat packages Per Garson had provided, then the lookout and a sight of the invaders on the beach. But the view from the lookout was very different from the one Peter and his friends had seen the day the Germans had come to Norway. The freighter had streamed out to sea and had disappeared. Out of the turmoil of unloading had come a little city. Long barracks rose up at the foot of the fishing pier. There were other orderly buildings to house equipment and supplies. The children began to recognize some of the Germans. Peter often saw the blue-eyed private who looked that first day as if he too would like to be sled riding. Then there was the captain who had turned his troops out of the path of Peter's sled. But him they saw no longer. He seemed to have gone away. There was a new commandant, and the tales about him that reached Ryswick were enough to make the blood run cold. There was now no doubt about passing the sentries. The children knew in advance they would not be stopped. Not even the fierce new commandant had thought to tell his pickets to challenge them. The Germans still tried to make friends with the children, but now, as before, they were met with silence. Cakes of chocolate were offered as bribes, but the venture ended its third week, and not a single Norwegian child had said as much as a hello to any of the Nazi soldiers. The four friends had separated after the first day. Each had his own team, and they met only when they passed on the road, or two of them met at the cave or the Snake, or when the day ended at the Holmes farm. Peter's team and Helga's would go out the same day, and Michael's team and Livisa's team the following morning. For the first time in the history of Ryswick, no one wanted to see spring come. Warm weather would bring the end of the snow and stop the sled trips. That far in the north, the snow lasted well into May, sometimes late May, but the thaw could come any time now, and indeed were looked for since winter had set in so early. If the snow holds, was the one thought in all the town. Could it stay long enough to get the whole 13 tons of bullion to the Snake? Well, it was an unusual year, everyone seemed to say. Never before had the snow been so deep. Not even Granny Gala, who was 90, remembered anything like it. Will the snow hold? The townspeople asked each other. Will it hold? Per Garson rubbed his whiskered chin thoughtfully. He looked out to the sky and smelled the air and looked at the very snow itself. Do you think it will last, Granny Gola? He asked. Yeah, I think it will, she answered brightly. It might even feel better, he told Peter. 3 weeks of hard sledding for the children. And what was the result? Back in the cave, Per Garson looked ruefully at the big stacks of bricks and remained. Why, they seemed hardly to have made a hole in them. How much more? Peter kept asking him. Well, he was no Mr. Anders, the schoolmaster, but as well as he could count, it would take another 3 weeks, maybe longer, to empty the cave. They hadn't been able to do all they expected. The smaller children couldn't pull the loads that Peter and Michael had. Michael and the bigger boys could haul. The sleds had to be dragged on the level stretches of the woods and down to the beach. The girls had to take fewer bricks. Lavisa, who after all was only 10, had been too tired after the first day, and now she carried 2 bricks where she had taken 4. But Helga insisted she was strong as any boy, and no one brick would she give up. If all had gone as the grown-ups planned, most of the gold would have been taken down those first few weeks. They'd counted on moving 4 tons a week, but that was expecting every child to take 4 bricks or 75 pounds on every sled load. But there were less than a dozen who could do that. Instead of 4 tons, they were averaging a little over 2 tons a week. Well, it can't be helped, Garson sighed. But the 3 whole weeks were gone, and the snow must melt sometime. If I only dared do it myself, Peter heard him moan. The day the sun shone itself not once. There was not the fanciest streak of brightness in the dishwasher gray of the sky. The wind had died out without a trace of breeze, even off the sea. Without the sun, it ought to have the same cold, Peter knew, but he had to open his lumber jacket as he pulled his sled home from Holmes' farm. Helga had crossed and tired, and the two had quarreled about which of them had been first at Holmes' pump. The quarrel was odd because Helga was ordinarily too busy to bother about such things, and Peter was known throughout the town for his even disposition. It was funny how as little a thing as the weather could disturb a whole day, he reflected as he lagged his way into town. At home, Pierre Garson complained of his bones aching. I don't need any almanac to tell me when there'll be a change in the weather, he said. Change in the weather? Peter's voice sounded high and excited. What sort of change? About Pierre Garson only shook his gray head and said nothing. After supper, Pierre went out to bring in the kindling. He threw a big log on the fire. The curtains were drawn for the blackout. Their dark, heavy folds showed not the tiniest brightness, not even a glint of reflection from the fire. The northern day had lengthened. It should have been twilight, so the darkness outside was all the more forbidding. Mrs. Lundstrom was knitting in the light of a lamp, with a shade especially designed for the blackout. The lamp cast a gloomy look rather than brightness. Peter felt his mother's thoughts must be far away, for she had not even looked up when Pierre Garson came in with the log. Per raked up the ashes and soon had a fine fire. The wood burst into flame, and to Peter the whole room seemed livelier for its dancing light. But it blew a hot, gusty breath under the corner where Mrs. Lundstrom sat. But Pierre, why don't we need such a big fire? She rebuked him gently. Why, it's hot enough in here to bake bread. I'm sorry, the old man mumbled. I guess I'm just plain absent-minded these days. My rheumatism, bothers me, and I forget. He shuffled out, and the fire tongs still in his hands. Peter went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. Pierre was busy locking the house for the night. When he had finished, he came back to the kitchen and carefully shielding the light so it would not be seen outside, peered through the window. But there was nothing to be found about the blackness. He stepped out of the doors. Peter followed him. He sensed more trouble or sorrow in the old man, and he tried to find words of comfort. He thought Pierre was ashamed at having been so careless as to build a big fire. Don't mind about that, he said. Mother doesn't really mind. Hey, what's that? Pierce seemed aware of Peter for the first time. About the fire. Wood's plentiful. What if you did build a big fire? It makes no difference, except it's too hot. Oh, that. Pierre seemed to shrug. It was so dark that neither of them could see the other. Pierre Garson shoved out his hand and in doing so struck Peter smartly on the shoulder. Peter hardly knew what to make of the sudden blow, especially when no apology or explanation followed. Clearly, Pierre Garson had no intentions of including the young master in what he was going on in his busy mind. But when next he spoke, Peter knew why he had been accidentally struck. Pierre Garson had only stretched forth his hand, and in doing so, hit Peter. But he found out what he wanted to know. He only spoke one word, but the word spelled catastrophe. Rain. Rain, he said. Oh boy, could mean some trouble for those snowmen and the gold. All right, let's see where we end up. Till next time.